Hello. Let's take a look at this essay on the short story 11. The short story 11 by Sandra Cisneros is about a girl turning 11 who is forced to claim a sweater that is actually not supposed to be in her possession. When Mrs. Price, the teacher, asks who owns the sweater, a different student replies that she thinks it's Rachel, the girl who just became 11 years old. Unfortunately, Mrs. Price agrees, and Rachel is told to put it on. However, towards the end, another girl remembers that the sweater belongs to her, and Rachel finally gets to be rid of it. I believe that Mrs. Price makes Rachel put the sweater on for several reasons. Now, let's take a look at the introduction really quickly. First thing that I don't like is the last sentence in the introduction. I believe that Mrs. Price makes Rachel put the sweater on for several reasons. Don't say several reasons. Say how many reasons you're going to talk about. So I think you have 3 reasons. So say, I believe that Mrs. Price makes Rachel put the sweater on for 3 reasons. Then a brief description, a hint, a brief statement about these 3 statements of these 3 reasons, would really make a difference. So you believe that Mrs. Price makes Rachel put on the sweater for 3 reasons. These 3 reasons are 1, 2, and 3. Or you can restate the sentence, for example, I believe that Mrs. Price makes Rachel put the sweater on because 1, 2, and 3. So I need to, in the introduction, know what your reasons are. I want to basically have an idea about what you're going to tell me later on. So this is something we want. Let's take a look at any grammatical mistakes here. The short story 11 by, and then the name of the author. The name of the story should be underlined. That's the way it should be. Okay, not between quotation marks, even though some writers do that. However, it is better to underline it. It's about a girl turning 11 who is forced to claim a sweater that is actually not supposed to be in her possession. When Mrs. Price, the teacher, another comma, so the teacher between 2 commas, when Mrs. Price, the teacher, comma, asks who owns the sweater, a different student replies that she thinks it's, as a comma here, an apostrophe, okay, or it is, and it's better to write it is, not with an apostrophe, not it's, so don't get confused. So she thinks it is Rachel, the girl who just became 11 years old. Unfortunately, Mrs. Price agrees, and Rachel is told to put it on. Now, if you take a look here, unfortunately, Mrs. Price agrees, this is a complete sentence. Then after and, you have another complete sentence. Rachel is told to put it on. When you have 2 complete sentences, we can't separate them with just an and. That's called a run-on sentence, okay? We put a comma with the end. However, towards the end, another girl remembers that the sweater belongs to her. Again, this is a complete sentence up here. Comma and. Rachel finally gets to be rid of it. Another complete sentence. So 2 complete sentences with a comma and an and in between. Now it's right. I believe that Mrs. Price makes Rachel put the sweater on for several reasons. As I said, do give me an idea about what these reasons are and how many they are. Now, what I don't like in the introduction also is that you actually summarized the whole story, whereas the question was, why do you believe Mrs. Price acted the way she did? You didn't have to give me all the details or summarize as much. I would have preferred a smaller summary and then a longer sentence or 2 detailing what the reasons are, or stating what these reasons are. It would be the same size almost, okay? But a little bit less of a summary and more of the reasons, the actual answer to the question. Remember, in the introduction, you need to answer your question. The question was, why do you believe Mrs. Price acted the way she did? Now, in your introduction, you don't want to answer the question. You just restate the story, and then at the end, you tell me, I think she did that for several reasons. You didn't even tell me what the reasons are. So this is something that you should modify, I believe, in your introduction. Now for the second paragraph. First, this is good to begin my first body paragraph using transitions, something like first, so that the reader knows that you have first, and then you have second, then you have third, you have 3 different reasons, or 2 or whatever, depending on your essay. However, having transitions like first at the beginning of the paragraph is a very good idea. First, I think Mrs. Price acted the way she did because Rachel couldn't speak up and say that the sweater did not originally belong to her. Great. So now we have a clear reason, a first reason, why Mrs. Price acted the way she did. Hence, Mrs. Price made Rachel wear the sweater. When Rachel described what she said, when Mrs. Price decided that the sweater was Rachel's, she stated. Too long of a sentence. Maybe we could remove this. So, for example, we can say, when Mrs. Price decided that the sweater was Rachel's, she stated. Here, she can be considered an ambiguous pronoun because it may refer to Rachel or Mrs. Price. So, if we say that Rachel's the one who stated, it would be better. She stated. That's not, I don't, you're not mine. I finally say, you are still completing the quote. I finally say, in a little voice that was maybe me when I was 4. Of course it's yours, Mrs. Price says. Okay, I remember you wearing it once. Because she's older and the teacher, she's right, and I'm not. Now here you have a dialogue, you have the whole conversation. It's really unclear who's saying what. I would prefer that you arrange them into 2 different sentences. So Rachel said whatever Rachel said, and then Mrs. Price replied whatever Mrs. Price said. But like this, it's a little bit confusing. You don't need this part because she's older and the teacher, she is right and I'm not. You don't have to overquote from the story because here you're basically talking about that Mrs. Price acted the way she did because Rachel couldn't speak up. So it's enough what Rachel said at the beginning that she couldn't speak up when she said, not mine, that's not, I don't, you're not mine. She wasn't able to convey her reason for refusing that jacket or that sweater. Okay, this proves that the teacher might have reconsidered making Rachel wear the sweater if the student had stood up and claimed that she had never worn the sweater before. Now, it's a good idea here to add this idea at the end, which basically you're saying that if Mrs. Price had done so and so, or sorry, if Rachel had done so and so, then Mrs. Price would have reacted in another way. That's fine. But all of a sudden you're talking about the teacher and the student instead of Rachel and Mrs. Price. That's a little bit confusing. If you stay with Rachel and Mrs. Price the way you did before, it would be a little bit better. Okay, now for the third paragraph. Next, nice beginning. Mrs. Price yelled at Rachel for several reasons. Since she assumed the sweater belonged. Okay, let's stop here. Now, we said that we need to answer the question. Why did Mrs. Price act the way she did? Now, you said several reasons up here, and we didn't like that. Then here you said first, and you gave me one reason and explained it perfectly. Now, in the second body paragraph right here, you say next. So that's number 2. So here's number 1, and here's reason number 2. Now, you started reason number 2 by saying next, Mrs. Price yelled at Rachel for several reasons. Again, don't say several reasons and then just give me one reason. So next, Mrs. Price yelled at Rachel for another reason. Since she assumed the sweater belonged to Rachel, Mrs. Price probably thought that Rachel was fooling around and being a nuisance in class when she pushed the red sweater to the edge of her desk. When Rachel stated how the teacher reacted to the sweater being on the corner of her desk, she said. Now, again, this is a long sentence. Look what you said here. You said, let me see. When Rachel stated how the teacher reacted to the sweater being on the corner of her desk, she said, and then you're still going to write what she said. You could make a little bit better by saying, for example, Rachel describes Mrs. Price's reaction by saying, okay? Or Mrs. Price reacted to seeing the sweater on Rachel's desk by saying, okay? Now, let's see. She said, Mrs. Price says loud and in front of everybody. Now, Rachel. See, so if you say by saying, you're going to start from here. Okay, Mrs. Price, by saying, now, Rachel. That's enough. Because she sees I've shoved the red sweater to the tippy tip corner of my desk. And it's hanging all over the edge like a waterfall. But I don't care. And then you continue. Rachel, Mrs. Price says, she says it like she's getting mad. You put that sweater on right now. And no more nonsense. But it's not. Now, Mrs. Price says, All of this, that's very long quotation from the story. It's almost the whole paragraph. Okay, that's not a good idea. So you need to make this a little bit shorter. Perhaps we can take away this if we said Mrs. Price reacts to the sweater being on the desk or seeing the sweater on the desk by saying, "Now Rachel, that's enough." Okay? Because she sees I've shoved the red sweater to the tippy-tip corner of my desk. And we can stop there. So you can continue by saying, for example, Mrs. Price continues by shouting, "Rachel!" And then, as if she's getting mad between quotation marks, so you don't need to quote the whole sentence. "You put that sweater on right now and no more nonsense." And we can stop there. This is evidence, again, this is evidence. Here, this can be considered an ambiguous pronoun because you actually mean everything you've just said in the few lines before. So again, we want this incident, this dialogue, this conversation, or Mrs. Price's words, Mrs. Price's actions, something like that, is evidence or give evidence that Mrs. Price yelled at Rachel because she thought Rachel was being silly and immature. So your second reason is very clear. Mrs. Price thought Rachel was being silly and immature. So at the beginning of this paragraph, when you said several reasons, again, that wasn't a good idea because you have one clear, nice reason that you should have emphasized at the beginning of the paragraph and then restated at the end of the paragraph like you did right now. Okay, one more. Here is the third reason. Furthermore, very nice, furthermore, really good, I believe that Mrs. Price was ignorant of the fact that Rachel was trying to tell her that the sweater should have been in someone else's possession. So now you are talking about a third clear reason, and that is that Mrs. Price simply couldn't understand or did not know that Rachel was trying to defend herself or explain that this sweater wasn't hers. Very good. Mrs. Price probably didn't pay attention to Rachel because she was very busy teaching. She probably felt. Don't say probably a lot. Don't say I think a lot. Try to give the reader a sense that you are sure of what you're saying. So if you're going to say probably once, don't say it twice. She probably felt like she didn't have the time to listen to Rachel. For example, when Rachel said the sweater was not hers, Mrs. Price ignored her and replied, "Of course it's yours. I remember you wearing it once." This, again, same thing, can vouch for the fact, not very good, we can say this exemplifies the fact, this emphasizes the fact, this illustrates the fact, this shows the fact that Mrs. Price was being too careless to actually listen to what Rachel was saying. Now, I like this reason. However, it seems that you didn't have enough time to develop the last paragraph here. It was a little bit hurried. Now, how does this show that Mrs. Price was being too careless? You can't emphasize that she said, "Of course it's yours, I remember you wearing it once." She was lying, okay, because it's not Rachel's. We find out at the end of the story that it's not Rachel's, so she was not wearing it before. So Mrs. Price needed to lie or to say that she saw Rachel wearing the sweater before just to get things over with, and that proves that she was actually careless and was not listening to what Rachel was saying, or did not give enough importance or weight to what Rachel was trying to do. Okay, final paragraph, your conclusion. In conclusion, good start. Mrs. Price was tough on, here, let's flip this. There you go. Mrs. Price was tough on Rachel because Rachel didn't defend herself. It looked like Rachel was being a nuisance and the teacher was being somewhat careless and ignorant. Really good. I really love how you summarized the reasons in your conclusion. I wanted to see something similar to this in your introduction as well. So when I read the introduction, I want to know that you have 3 solid reasons. Then in each of the 3 paragraphs afterwards, I can see the details of those reasons. And then in the conclusion, you remind me, you sum up the 3 reasons one more time, which you did really, really well. Thus, I believe that to avoid such a situation, Mrs. Price should listen to Rachel, and Rachel should stand up for herself. Big mistake. You're saying that you believe now that to avoid such a situation in the future, Mrs. Price should listen to Rachel in the future, and Rachel should stand up for herself in the future. That's a story, so you can't think that things should be done later on. So you should have restated the sentence in a way by saying, for example, I believe that if Rachel had wanted to avoid such a confrontation, she should have done this and that. Or Mrs. Price was supposed to think that way. You should give something in the past tense if you want to give your opinion about what happened in that story. Overall, very good work. Your language is good. Your organization of your thoughts. Ooh, okay. The organization of your thoughts and the way you presented the essay is systematic. Your use of transitions is very good. You have some minor grammar mistakes. However, the major thing is that you quote too much from the story. It is very important to take quotations from the story. However, if it's too much, then it shows that you're not writing anything. You're just taking parts of the story and putting them together. That's the only main thing I can see here. Please review this video over and over again, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Okay, it was my pleasure.